2-gallon tank. It was a little 1 foot by 1 foot square. And for Christmas, we started going to Finn's and things, that beautiful little pet store just right up 2 blocks from here. And started to build a relationship with people at the pet store. And so we were in there all the time, and I saw this beautiful tank in the used kind of tank section. You know, it's kind of a small town thing where people can take back old stuff and they can exchange it for new stuff. And so there was this beautiful, like 29-gallon, ginormous tank. And it had a stand and everything, and so it was a really good price. So we got that for Sophie for Christmas. And so we had this huge tank, and so we decided that we're going to go get some more fish because our tank is just so big that we need some more fish. And so we can't just drop fish in the new tank because the temperature change can kill them, so you have to put them in these bags and just set the bag on top of the water and let the water acclimate to the same temperature before you can release the fish. And so we got the old fish from the old tank and the new fish from the new tank. And when we cut open the bags and let the fish into the tank, it was really weird to see what happened. The new fish swam around the whole tank like it was just they were exploring like they'd never been there before. And they were expansive. They had this view of freedom, and they'd move around the whole tank. But the old fish, they were used to this little tiny 1 foot by 1 foot square. And so the weirdest thing, the old fish would sit in this corner, and they'd swim up to the top, and they'd stay in this little tiny 1 foot by 1 foot square. And it took a couple of days of watching the fish swim all the way to the other end of the tank and back before the old fish finally learned the full extent of their freedom. And I think in our spiritual lives, we can do the same thing. You know, when Jesus said it's finished, he pointed us to a new freedom that we experience as his followers. And many of us are stuck in these old systems of thinking, these old boundaries that we have created for ourselves. And we don't live into the fullness of our salvation and the fullness of the freedom that God is calling us to experience. You know, like those fish, we let our fears keep us trapped in this small cage of our own making. We don't ever grow beyond it. So today I want to wrestle a little bit with the significance of Jesus' freedom that he purchased for us on the cross. And the freedom that we have in Christ is a little bit different looking than the freedom we often would imagine or think of. So one of my fondest memories of freedom when I was a child, I was about 16, and I used to hitchhike a lot. My mom was gone most summers because she worked for fire season. And so we were 2 single parent a lot. And so a lot of the time when I was 16 years old, I pretty much took care of myself. And often I'd go hitchhiking out of town and do all kinds of crazy stuff that I would never do now. But I was very naive when I was 16, rebellious. And so anyway, I used to hitchhike a lot in the Columbia River Gorge, which is a really desolate place. And I'd be 50 miles from home all the time. And I remember one time I was really far. I was the only person there, and it was a warm day, and there was this kind of gentle, warm wind kind of pouring over my body. And I remember feeling so free. All the troubles that I had growing up and all those troubles back home were back home. And I was apart from that. And I was alone, where no one could hurt me or bother me, and I felt so free. I was walking unencumbered. So, but that's not always the kind of freedom that Jesus calls us to. It's not the kind of freedom where we're just free and alone and we can do anything we want and no one won't tell us that it's wrong or right. You know, it's not the kind of freedom that bikers point to when they say the phrase, live free or die. It's not the kind of freedom that people talk about when they say, I would rather live on my feet than die on my knees. It's not the kind of freedom that's based on the idea of a successful rebellion, whereby no one can keep us under their thumb or on a leash anymore. There's a great poet named William Ernest Henley, and he wrote a poem called Invictus. And many of us know that poem because there was a movie called Invictus that came out recently about Nelson Mandela and the moves that he made to try to bring healing and reconciliation to his country after apartheid had been restored, was released from prison and became the president of the country. And what he had was a very racially divided country where people were angry at the white people It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the spoil. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. In my experience following Jesus, this isn't the sort of freedom that's hinted at by Jesus' death on the cross. It's not this kind of isolationist freedom that's part of some kind of individualistic rebellion, where we play it at being masters of our fate or captains of our soul. Far from calling us to a life free from submission to anything, Jesus calls us to submit to him and to each other out of reverence for him. I find submission a huge part of the Christian life. In fact, I don't think there's anywhere you could go if you're really following Jesus that doesn't call you to submission. God calls us to be a community, and without interdependency and mutual submission, you can't have a community. You can have isolation, you can have totalitarianism, but you can't have a community. Freedom, as I've experienced it in recovery, is also not quite what I was expecting. I was expecting that someday I would be free from all temptations, that as I got off drugs and alcohol, that I would never be tempted ever again. And that's not the sort of freedom that I found either. It's not freedom from temptation. It's freedom within that temptation. Freedom to swim upstream and to find the narrow gate and the narrow way that few people find. So biblical freedom isn't what bikers mean when they talk about living free or dying. And it's not what Henry wrote about not being controlled by anyone else. There are at least two parts of the freedom that Jesus bought us that I want to talk about today. Two parts of what Jesus hinted at when he said it is finished. There's the freedom from and the freedom to. We find the freedom from the sinful cycles that have held us back in the past. The freedom to let the elements of death in our lives truly die. And there's the freedom to, the freedom to experience new life and resurrection. To be transformed into children of God. And as children who are being made new creations and being redefined in Jesus' image. And so in our lives, just as on the cross, Jesus could bring us resurrection in his life. And I think we often don't like this kind of idea of freedom to die. We want to experience the resurrected life, but we don't want to let things within us die. So there's no shortcuts to the life that God calls us to. We have to be willing to let something die, let some things die in our lives. Michelangelo, the famous artist, was both a painter and a sculptor. And he talked about those two mediums as painting as the art of adding to, and sculpting as the art of taking away. And when I think of God's handiwork in our lives, I think of those two things. I think of God adding things to our lives and removing things. And within art, as in any other creative thing, form follows function. And the freedom that God gave us through Jesus on the cross isn't this sort of fill-in-the-blanks, purposeless kind of freedom. It's the freedom to be recreated in Jesus' image according to God's plan, not just our own plan. It's the freedom to be who God is creating us to be. The Greek word for finish that Jesus used here is telos, which is also used a lot in philosophy, but here it means to complete. It means to have achieved its purpose. So when Jesus is saying it's finished, he's not talking about his life running out of steam. He's talking about the work that he did on the cross and how it's complete and full. So there's really nothing that we can add to that work. There's nothing needed to add to it, and there's nothing that we can take away. It's just a fact. In the Greek, it's used in a perfect tense, which means that it's a thing that happened in the past and still matters. It's an effect that has an ongoing effect even now in our lives. Since we've been going through the 7 last sayings of Jesus on the cross, we've talked about redemption and how the biblical idea of redemption is the idea of being bought back from slavery. We accept the work of Christ as something that we're not able to do for ourselves, and response to that, we live lives of freedom. But the nature of freedom that we have in Christ is different from the kinds of freedom that the world likes to entertain. It's far more amazing than the limits that we would put on it. Many of you are familiar with Martin Luther, the great reformer. And he wrote so much that he almost wrote his weight in pages. But he wrote a little tiny book that I had to read for my church history class called The Freedom of a Christian. And it's only about 40 pages long. And it talks about the paradoxical relationship of the freedom that we have in Jesus. And so for Luther, freedom was relational. It was the opposite of the kind of freedom that we find, say, in the poem Invictus. Luther writes, "From faith there flows a love and joy in the Lord. From love there proceeds a joyful, willing, and free mind that serves the neighbor and takes no account of gratitude or ingratitude, praise or blame, gain or loss. We do not serve others with an eye toward making them obligated to us. Nor do we distinguish friends or enemies, or anticipate their thankfulness or ingratitude. Rather, we freely and willingly spend ourselves in all that we have." And I think this freedom talks about the same sort of freedom that Jesus had as he was on the cross. Even though the world was trying to control him, even though he was put in a place where he was going to experience pain, he willingly put himself there. And even on the cross, he was free. And he lived out those sorts of values, and he calls us to do the same. The main point of Luther's book can be summed up in two paradoxical statements about freedom. And here they are. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to no one. And a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant, subject to everyone. Here we find Luther wrestling with the true paradox that's Christian freedom. A Christian is perfectly free, subject to no single person on earth, except for Christ, our Savior. Yet a Christian is also a servant, subject to others as we try to live out the love that Jesus has put in our lives and love one another as ourselves and serve our neighbor. A Christian is subject to all as we try to serve the least, the lost, and the last that God has put in our lives. And so we're free from the old rules and regulations of the Old Testament, and we're free from the rules that we often like to add to the Old Testament. But we're bound by a law of love that holds us to a much higher standard than any of those things could. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to no one. And a Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant, subject to everyone. A long time ago, there was a woman at Silverton Friends who, her name was Gwyneth, and she had breast cancer. And I remember praying for her as she wrestled with breast cancer. And we had a pretty good relationship. And I was always checking in to see how she did and encouraging her in her battle with breast cancer. And we were at church one day, and she came up to me, and she had this pink bracelet, like the Lance Armstrong kind of bracelet you've probably seen. It was just bright pink rubber bracelet. And she said, "Will you wear this for me?" And I didn't want to wear it. You know, I'm a macho construction worker guy. You know, people are really rough at work. When, you know, if there's any sign of weakness, you know, I remember taking that bracelet and thinking, God, no, I don't want to wear this. But as Gwyneth came up to me and she said, "Will you wear this to me?" there was no other answer that I could speak except for yes. You know, as much as I wanted the side of freedom that's a Christian is free of all. A Christian is subject to Gwyneth. You know, that's the side of freedom that I was experiencing there. And so this pink bracelet didn't work with my bad boy construction worker outfit, you know. But I wore it to work. I wore it through like 3 or 4 of those things. And it reminded me to pray for Gwyneth. It actually freed me from a lot of the fears that I had about being myself at work. And there's a whole bunch of things about wearing that bracelet that submitting to wearing that bracelet brought into my life. So God is pushing me in the direction of dutiful servant. And I'm still not a huge fan of pink. In fact, I hate pink, honestly. It's not my thing. And God, in His infinite wisdom, has blessed me with two daughters. And so his new favorite color is pink. And if thanks to you and many members of my family, and she's got all this Hello Kitty stuff. And her room is just completely covered in pink. It looks like Hello Kitty just exploded and landed on everything. So God brings stuff into our lives we wouldn't necessarily imagine. It's profoundly good. Jesus gave us freedom to live a new kind of life and to be a new creation. He redefined freedom as something that's costly. There are many patriotic people here who often have said freedom isn't free. Usually when they say that, they're talking about the sacrifice of a soldier. And many of us who have a different vision of peace have often choked on those words. Freedom isn't free, but it's so true. Just take the statement at face value. Freedom isn't free. Our freedom cost Jesus everything. And so we have this wonderful freedom that we get to experience as Christians. But really, what do we use it for? That's the question I feel like we need to wrestle through as a community. Luther points us to a paradox, this creative tension between being a servant and being not having a master. And a paradox is a funny way of describing a mystery where there's these two poles, these two seemingly contradictory statements that if they're not held in tension, really can result in heresy. So there's a paradox in this Christian freedom that we experience. Christian is perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to no one. But that left by itself can leave us living like spoiled brats. We can become aloof and uncaring. We can use our freedom as an excuse to live out the selfish, self-seeking psychosis of our culture. A Christian is perfectly dutiful servant, subject to everyone. Left by itself can lead us to disassociation. We can become spineless. So we need both sides of the paradox. So we find the freedom to submit to Jesus and the freedom to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Find a new vision of freedom from a God who both adds and takes things away from our lives. We're pruned and we lose both our arrogance and our spinelessness in this freedom that we experience from Jesus. We find the freedom to become fully human and to be fully present with each other as a community. So as we go into this time of worship, I want a few queries to guide our time, but after that time I want us to regather back and kind of wrestle through some of these things together as a community. The queries that are going to guide our time, I'll read them for you and I'll put them up on the board here. Where have you experienced freedom and found victory in your life? Where does God need to expand or redefine our concept of freedom and recreate it? Where are you still swimming around in a little box, stuck in the old boundaries of your own thinking? And where do you see God adding or taking away as God conforms you to His image? So I went to a pastor short course this week, and I met a young pastor, our first African-American pastor in the Iowa Yearly Meeting, as far as I know. His name is Joseph May. He's the new pastor at Light of the Lakes Friends Church, really far away from here. And we came up in a different conversation, but one of the ways that he processes things in his community is to ask 3 questions at the end and have people talk about them with each other. And I really think that it'd be fun to try out this morning. We're not going to do it the same way that he does. He actually has a part of his bulletin that people have to write their answers down and rip them off and hand them to someone
guess what the challenge really is how do I explore my freedom within the context of solution? My personality is to explore distant fields. One of the reasons I'm going to do that is I believe that I have the freedom to do that. I don't want people having expectations that I feel inspired by. And I think that there's something to that. But I think the challenge for me is going to be to try to explore the freedom within the context of discerning when I should be sleeping, others time to living with the lessons, in terms of an action plan.